That October morning, the sterile smell of disinfectant couldn't mask the scent of approaching death. I sat beside Grandpa Harrison's hospital bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest grow weaker with each labored breath. The machines surrounding him beeped in a rhythm that felt like a countdown to goodbye. His weathered hand, once strong enough to lay foundation stones and build an empire, now trembled as it reached for mine. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. His eyes, though clouded with pain, still held that sharp intelligence that had built Harrison Construction from nothing into Seattle's most respected building company. "Come closer, son." I leaned in, feeling the weight of 32 years of memories with this man who had been more of a father to me than my own dad ever was. Grandpa Harrison had raised me after my mother died when I was 12, taking me into his sprawling Bellevue mansion while my father, David, was too busy drowning his grief in alcohol and eventually in the arms of Victoria, my stepmother. "There's something I need to give you," Grandpa whispered, his grip on my hand growing urgent. "But not here. Too many ears." I glanced around the private room. We were alone, but I could hear Victoria's sharp voice echoing down the hallway, probably arguing with nurses about visiting hours or demanding special treatment. She and my half-brother Cameron had been hovering around the hospital like vultures for the past 3 days, ever since Grandpa's heart attack. "What is it, Grandpa?" I asked, stroking his gray hair the way he used to stroke mine during thunderstorms when I was a scared kid. "In my coat pocket," he breathed, his eyes darting toward the small closet where his clothes hung. "Small USB drive, blue one. Take it now, before they come back." My heart pounded as I quickly moved to the closet. Victoria and Cameron had stepped out for coffee 20 minutes ago, but they could return any moment. I found the tiny blue USB drive hidden in the inner pocket of his wool coat, no bigger than my thumbnail. "What's on it, Grandpa?" "Everything," he said, his eyes burning with an intensity that reminded me of the man who had built skyscrapers and shopping centers across 3 states. "The real will, the recordings, the proof of what they've been doing behind our backs." Before I could ask what he meant, the sound of Victoria's heels clicking against the linoleum announced her return. I quickly slipped the USB drive into my jeans pocket just as she burst through the door, her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer dress looking grotesquely out of place in the sterile hospital room. "Marcus, you've been here long enough," she said coldly, not even glancing at Grandpa Harrison. "Cameron and I need to discuss some business matters with Harrison." "Business matters?" I stood up, anger flaring in my chest. "He's dying, Victoria. This isn't the time for what? Family responsibility?" Her blue eyes, cold as winter Seattle rain, fixed on me with disdain. "Some of us actually care about preserving what Harrison built, instead of just waiting around for handouts." Cameron slouched in behind her, his 26-year-old frame carrying the softness of someone who had never worked a real day in his life. Unlike me, who had spent summers since age 14 learning construction from the ground up alongside Grandpa's crews, Cameron had coasted through an expensive private college on Harrison money while studying business management, which, as far as I could tell, meant partying and spending our grandfather's money on sports cars and spring break trips to Europe. "Hey, Marcus," Cameron said with that smirk that had irritated me since childhood. "Shouldn't you be at work or something? You know, that little contractor job you do." That little contractor job. I had been working as Harrison Construction's project manager for the past 8 years, overseeing multi-million-dollar developments, while Cameron occasionally showed up to shadow Grandpa in the executive office, usually hungover and always unprepared. "I'm staying with Grandpa," I said firmly, returning to his bedside. "Actually," Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade, "we've already discussed this with the doctors. Family meetings need to be limited to immediate family only. Harrison's condition is very delicate." "I am immediate family. You're Harrison's grandson through David's first marriage," she said, pulling out her phone and checking her manicured nails as if bored by the conversation. "Cameron is his grandson through current family structure. There's a difference." The words hit like a physical blow. Current family structure. As if my mother's death had somehow made me less of a Harrison, less worthy of being here in Grandpa's final moments. Grandpa's hand squeezed mine weakly, and when I looked down, his eyes were telling me to go. He knew what I was feeling, the same exclusion, the same favoritism that had poisoned family gatherings for 20 years. But his look also told me something else. Trust the USB drive. Fine, I said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. I love you, Grandpa. I'll see you tomorrow. Love you too, son, he whispered, and I caught Victoria rolling her eyes at the word son. I left the hospital with my hands shaking and the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket. The October rain was falling in that persistent Seattle way, turning the world gray and washing the city clean. I drove home to my small Capitol Hill apartment, my mind racing with questions about what Grandpa had meant by the real will and recordings. That night, I sat at my laptop with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. The USB drive felt heavier than it should have as I turned it over in my fingers. Outside my apartment window, the city lights blurred through rain-streaked glass, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic on I-5. I plugged in the drive. The folder that opened contained 4 files: Will Official 2024.pdf, Will Filed 2024.pdf, Recordings 2023-2024, and a document simply titled, For Marcus, Read First. My hands trembled as I opened the letter addressed to me. Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone, and Victoria and Cameron are already making their moves. I've known for over a year what they've been planning, and I've been gathering evidence. You were always the one who truly cared about this family and this business. Not the money, not the status, but the work itself and the people who depend on it. What you'll find in these files will hurt. But you need to know the truth about who you're dealing with. The will they're going to read at my funeral is not the real one. I changed my will 6 months ago after I discovered what Victoria had been doing with the company finances and what she and Cameron have been saying about you behind closed doors. The real will leaves Harrison Construction to you. All of it. The house, the assets, everything. You've earned it through years of dedication and hard work. Victoria gets a generous settlement and Cameron gets his trust fund. But the company stays with someone who actually understands what it means to build something that lasts. The recordings will explain everything else. Listen to them all, even when it gets difficult. Especially when it gets difficult. You are my pride and joy, Marcus. Don't let them steal what we built together. All my love, Grandpa Harrison. P. The lawyer who filed the fake will is named Roberts. My real lawyer is Janet Chen at Chen & Associates. She has copies of everything and is waiting for your call. I sat back in my chair, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. Harrison Construction, the company I had poured my heart into, the crews I had worked beside, the legacy that defined our family, was supposed to be mine. But Victoria and Cameron had somehow filed a fake will. With shaking fingers, I opened the recordings folder. There were dozens of audio files, each labeled with dates spanning the past year. I clicked on the oldest one, dated 13 months ago. Cameron's voice filled my laptop speakers, tinny but clear. I mean, he's not even really family anymore, Mom. Dad's basically forgotten about his first marriage, and Marcus just hangs around like some kind of charity case. Victoria's response was sharp and calculating. The problem is Harrison. He still thinks of Marcus as his little golden boy. It's disgusting, really. Marcus has never had to fight for anything. Harrison just handed him a job, a position, everything. But Harrison Construction should be mine, Cameron whined. I'm the actual heir. I'm your son, and you're married to David. Marcus is just left over from before. Exactly, and that's why we need to be smart about this. Harrison is getting older, more sentimental. If he makes Marcus his successor, we'll be cut out of everything we've worked for. What do you mean, worked for? I paused the recording, my blood boiling. Victoria had never worked a day at Harrison Construction. Her work consisted of hosting charity galas and spending Grandpa's money on designer clothes and luxury vacations. I fast-forwarded through several more recordings, each one revealing another layer of their conspiracy. They had been systematically undermining me at company meetings I wasn't invited to, spreading rumors about my lack of business acumen to Harrison's associates, and even suggesting that my dedication to the hands-on construction work made me unsuited for executive leadership. but the recording that made my hands clench into fists was dated just 3 months ago. Victoria's voice. The Bellevue project is perfect. When it goes over budget, we can blame Marcus's management. Harrison will see that Marcus isn't ready for real responsibility. Cameron. But what if Marcus figures out we're the ones who changed the supplier contracts? Victoria. He won't. Marcus trusts family. That's his weakness. He actually believes we're all on the same side. They had sabotaged my project, the Bellevue residential complex that had gone 15% over budget, nearly costing me my job and reputation. They had orchestrated the whole thing by secretly changing our supplier agreements to more expensive contractors, then blamed me for the cost overruns. I grabbed my coffee mug and threw it against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces that reflected the kitchen light like broken promises. 20 years of birthday parties where I got gifts from the clearance rack while Cameron got the latest gaming systems. 20 years of family vacations where I got the fold-out couch while Cameron got the guest bedroom. 20 years of being treated like a tolerated intruder in my own family. But this was different. This wasn't just favoritism or casual cruelty. This was theft. I opened the will documents and compared them side by side. The fake will, which would apparently be read at Grandpa's funeral, left Harrison Construction to Cameron in recognition of his business education and future leadership potential. I was mentioned only as receiving sentimental personal items and a modest financial settlement in appreciation for his years of service to the company. Years of service. As if I had been an employee instead of family. The real will was completely different. Harrison Construction, the mansion in Bellevue, the investment portfolio, everything went to me, with specific language about my dedication to the craft and values that built this company. Victoria received a substantial cash settlement that would keep her comfortable for life, and Cameron got his trust fund, but the company and properties came to me. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed my father's number. Marcus? Dad's voice sounded strained, older than his 58 years. I have some bad news. What happened? Harrison passed away about an hour ago. Victoria called from the hospital. The words hit me like a punch to the chest, even though I had been expecting them. Grandpa Harrison was gone. The man who had taught me to read blueprints, who had shown me how to mix concrete and lay tile, who had made me feel like I belonged somewhere, he was gone. The funeral is Thursday, Dad continued. Victoria's handling the arrangements. She said Harrison left specific instructions about who should be involved in the planning. Let me guess, I'm not invited to help plan my own grandfather's funeral. Marcus, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Victoria's grieving too, and Cameron barely knew Grandpa, I snapped. He spent more time at country clubs than construction sites. Look, just try to keep the peace this week, okay? Family is family. After Dad hung up, I sat alone in my apartment with the truth burning in my laptop screen and grief settling in my chest like concrete. Grandpa Harrison was gone, but he had left me a weapon against the people who wanted to erase me from our family legacy. I called in sick to work for the rest of the week and spent the time researching everything I could about will disputes, fraudulent filings, and inheritance law. I also called Janet Chen, the lawyer Grandpa had mentioned in his letter. Marcus Harrison, she said when I identified myself. I've been expecting your call. I'm so sorry for your loss. Miss Chen, I need to know about my grandfather's will, the real one. Yes, I have copies of everything. Your grandfather was very thorough. He suspected there might be attempts to circumvent his wishes, so he took extra precautions. Can you come to my office Friday morning, the day after the funeral? Will they read a will at the funeral? If they do, it won't be the legal one. I have the only officially filed copy of your grandfather's final will, dated 6 months ago. Any other document claiming to be his last will and testament is fraudulent. Thursday morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical Seattle funeral weather. I dressed in my best black suit, not as expensive as Cameron's designer outfit would be, but appropriate and respectful. The funeral was being held at St. Mark's Cathedral, followed by burial at Lakeview Cemetery. I arrived early, hoping to have a few quiet moments with Grandpa's casket before the circus began. The cathedral was already filling with people from Seattle's construction and business communities. Grandpa Harrison had been well respected, known for fair dealing and quality work. These people knew him as a builder and businessman, not as the warm, patient man who had taught me to tie my shoes and helped me with algebra homework. Victoria stood near the entrance, greeting guests in a flowing black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her makeup was perfect, her grief performed for maximum sympathy. Cameron stood beside her in a black suit that fit like it had been tailored specifically for this occasion, shaking hands and accepting condolences like he was already the head of the family business. "Marcus," Victoria approached me with what she probably thought was a warm smile. "I'm so glad you could make it. I know Harrison would have wanted you here. Would have wanted me here, at my own grandfather's funeral. Of course I'm here, Victoria. He was my grandfather." "Yes, well," she adjusted her black pearls, "we'll be reading Harrison's will after the burial at the house. Just immediate family, you understand. Legal requirements and all that. I'll be there. Actually, Marcus, I think there might be some confusion. The will reading is really just for primary beneficiaries. You know how these legal things are. Very complicated, lots of technical language. We don't want to overwhelm everyone with details that don't really apply to them." I felt that familiar burn of exclusion, but this time it was tempered by the knowledge of what was really happening. "I think I can handle complicated legal language, Victoria. I'll be there." Her smile faltered slightly. "Well, if you insist, but please remember this is a difficult time for Cameron and me. We're the ones who will be carrying on Harrison's legacy now." The funeral service was beautiful and heartbreaking. Person after person stood up to talk about Grandpa Harrison's integrity, his commitment to quality, his fairness in business dealings. A foreman who had worked for him for 30 years talked about how Harrison had paid for his daughter's medical treatments when insurance wouldn't cover them. A rival contractor spoke about how Harrison had helped him get back on his feet after a job went bad. But through it all, I kept glancing at Victoria and Cameron in the front row, knowing what they had planned. They sat there accepting condolences and sympathies, playing the role of grieving family while preparing to steal everything Grandpa had built. After the burial, a small group gathered at the Bellevue mansion for the will reading. The house felt enormous and empty without Grandpa's presence. I had spent countless weekends here as a kid, learning to cook his famous Sunday pancakes and watching old westerns on his massive television. Now it felt like a museum, all familiar objects turned strange by grief. Present for the will reading were myself, Dad, Victoria, Cameron, and Roberts, the lawyer Victoria had mentioned in the recordings. Roberts was a thin, nervous man who kept checking his watch and avoiding eye contact with me. "Before we begin," Victoria announced, settling into Grandpa's favorite leather chair like she already owned it, "I want everyone to know that Harrison spent a lot of time thinking about his legacy and what would be best for the family business. His decisions may seem unexpected to some people, but they reflect his deep concern for Harrison Construction's future." Roberts cleared his throat and opened a legal folder. The last will and testament of Harrison James Harrison, dated 18 months ago. 18 months ago. The fake will was older than the real one, which meant they had somehow prevented Grandpa from filing his newer will, or they had filed the fake one and hidden the real one. Either way, it was fraud. "To my son David Harrison, I leave my fishing cabin in the San Juan Islands and the boat Maria's memory, along with a financial settlement of $200,000. Dad nodded, tears in his eyes. The cabin had been named after my mother, and some of my best childhood memories were of fishing trips there with Dad and Grandpa before everything got complicated. "To my grandson Cameron Harrison, I leave my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $1.2 million, to support his future endeavors and business education." Cameron actually smiled. Victoria squeezed his hand proudly. "To my grandson Marcus Harrison, I leave my personal tools, workshop equipment, and a financial settlement of $50,000 in appreciation for his dedication to learning the construction trade." $50,000 and some tools. For 8 years of 60-hour work weeks, for learning every aspect of the business, for caring about the quality and reputation that Grandpa had spent his life building. And finally, I leave Harrison Construction Company, including all assets, properties, ongoing contracts, and the family home in Bellevue, to my beloved daughter-in-law, Victoria Harrison, with the understanding that she will guide the company into its next phase of growth under Cameron's eventual leadership. The room was silent except for the ticking of Grandpa's grandfather clock in the corner. Victoria had inherited everything, not Cameron, despite all the recordings about his rightful inheritance, but Victoria herself. There are additional provisions, Roberts continued, but those are the primary bequests. Mrs. Harrison, you are now the sole owner of Harrison Construction. Victoria's performance of grief suddenly transformed into something that looked suspiciously like triumph. I know this is a shock to everyone. Harrison and I had many long conversations about the future of the company, and he felt that my business background and Cameron's education made us the best choice to carry on his legacy. Business background. Victoria's business background consisted of spending money and hosting charity galas. I want everyone to know, she continued, standing up and moving to Grandpa's desk like she was already claiming territory, that I take this responsibility very seriously. Cameron and I have already been discussing some exciting changes for Harrison Construction. Modernization, efficiency improvements, perhaps some strategic partnerships with larger development firms. Strategic partnerships. They were going to sell out the company Grandpa had built from nothing. When do I need to clear out of my office? I asked quietly. Victoria turned to me with what might have been genuine surprise. Clear out? Marcus, what are you talking about? I assume you'll want your own project managers, people who share your vision for the company's future. Marcus, Cameron spoke up for the first time, your family. Of course, you'll always have a place at Harrison Construction. Maybe not in the same capacity, but we'll find something that fits your skill set. Something that fits my skill set. 8 years as project manager, and now they were talking about finding me something, like I was a charity case they couldn't quite get rid of. That's very generous, I said, standing up. I'll need some time to think about it. Of course, Victoria's voice was syrupy sweet. Take all the time you need. This is a big adjustment for all of us. I left the mansion feeling like I was walking through a dream. Everything looked the same. The manicured gardens, the circular driveway, the view of Lake Washington through the trees, but it all belonged to Victoria now. The business I had devoted my career to, the home where I had spent my teenage years, the legacy that connected me to my grandfather, all of it was gone. But as I drove home, I thought about the USB drive and the reel wheel waiting in Janet Chen's office. Victoria and Cameron thought they had won, but they had no idea what was coming. Friday morning, I sat in Janet Chen's downtown office overlooking Elliott Bay. She was a small, precise woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. On her desk were copies of all the documents from Grandpa's USB drive, along with additional legal papers I hadn't seen before. Marcus, I want you to understand something before we proceed, she said, leaning forward with her hands folded. What happened yesterday was not just inheritance fraud. It was criminal fraud involving forged documents, identity theft, and potentially embezzlement if Victoria has been accessing your grandfather's accounts. How long will it take to prove it? The will issue is straightforward. I have the original, officially filed will right here. Your grandfather filed it with King County 6 months ago, with all proper witnesses and notarization. Any other will claiming to be more recent is automatically invalid. But Victoria's lawyer said theirs was the official one. Roberts isn't your grandfather's lawyer. I am. Roberts was hired by Victoria 3 months ago. We have records of her paying his fees. Your grandfather never authorized him to handle any estate matters. Janet opened a thick folder and spread documents across her desk. Harrison was very thorough. He not only filed the real will officially, but he also documented every step Victoria and Cameron took to undermine the company and you personally. Bank records showing unexplained expenditures, email communications between Victoria and outside contractors, even security footage from the office showing Cameron going through confidential files after hours. Security footage? Your grandfather installed cameras in the executive office 6 months ago. after he suspected someone was accessing sensitive company information. He has Cameron on video photographing construction contracts and project budgets. He also has Victoria on video meeting with representatives from Meridian Development Group. Meridian Development Group was one of Seattle's largest construction companies and Harrison Construction's biggest competitor. If Victoria had been meeting with them secretly, it could only mean one thing. She was planning to sell the company, probably at a fraction of its real value in exchange for personal compensation. What do we do now? First, we file an emergency injunction to freeze all Harrison Construction assets pending investigation of the fraudulent will. Second, we present the real will to the court and establish you as the rightful heir. Third, we press criminal charges against Victoria, Cameron, and Roberts for conspiracy to commit fraud. How long before I can take control of the company? If everything goes smoothly, 2 to 3 weeks. But Marcus, you need to understand that this is going to get ugly. Victoria isn't going to give up without a fight, and she'll probably try to turn your father and other family members against you. Let her try. Grandpa Harrison left me everything I need to prove who's been lying. Janet smiled for the first time since I had arrived. Your grandfather was very proud of you, Marcus. He talked about you every time we met. He said you were the only one who understood that Harrison Construction wasn't just a business, it was a commitment to building things that last. That afternoon, I returned to work at Harrison Construction for what I thought might be the last time as an employee. The office felt different now, knowing that Victoria legally owned it for the moment, and that Cameron would probably be showing up soon to start making his efficiency improvements. I was reviewing project schedules in my office when Cameron appeared in my doorway, wearing a expensive-looking polo shirt and khakis instead of his usual designer suits. His attempt at looking like a serious businessman would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. "Hey, Marcus, got a minute?" "What do you want, Cameron?" He stepped into my office and closed the door, then sat down in the chair across from my desk without being invited. "Look, I know yesterday was weird for you. This whole situation is weird for all of us." "Weird? Is that what we're calling it?" "Marcus, come on. You had to know that Grandpa couldn't leave the company to you. I mean, you're great at the construction stuff, the hands-on work, but running a business is different. It requires education, management training, financial background." "Is that right?" "Yeah. Mom has an MBA from UW, and I studied business at Seattle Pacific. You've got, a community college construction management certificate?" I leaned back in my chair and studied my half-brother. 26 years old, never worked a real day in his life, couldn't tell a 2x4 from a 4x4, and he was lecturing me about business qualifications. "Cameron, in your business education, did they teach you anything about embezzlement?" His face went pale. "What are you talking about? Or fraud? Did they cover fraud in any of your classes?" "Marcus, I don't know what you're implying, but..." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Did you think Grandpa didn't know about your little after-hours visits to his office? The photographing of confidential contracts? The meetings with Meridian Development?" Cameron stood up quickly, knocking over the chair. "You're crazy. You're just upset because you didn't get what you wanted and now you're making up conspiracy theories." "The security cameras aren't conspiracy theories, Cameron. The bank records aren't conspiracy theories. The real will isn't a conspiracy theory." "The real will? What are you talking about?" "Roberts read Grandpa's will yesterday. You were there. Roberts read a fake will that Victoria paid him to create. The real will is filed with King County and it leaves everything to me." Cameron's face went through several color changes, white to red to gray. "That's impossible," Mom said. "Mom said Grandpa told her." "Mom lied to you, Cameron. She's been lying to all of us for months, but it's over now. You can't prove any of this." "Actually, I can. Grandpa left me everything I need to prove it. USB drives are amazing little devices. You can fit hours of audio recordings on something smaller than your thumbnail." Cameron bolted from my office without another word. I could hear him on his phone in the hallway, probably calling Victoria to tell her that their plan was falling apart. Within an hour, Victoria herself stormed into the office, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled and her makeup smudged like she had been crying or screaming. She marched straight into my office without knocking and slammed the door behind her. "What the hell do you think you're playing at?" she hissed. "I'm not playing at anything, Victoria. I'm claiming what's rightfully mine." "Rightfully yours? You've been handed everything your entire life. Harrison gave you a job, a position, opportunities that Cameron had to fight for." "Fight for?" "Cameron has never fought for anything. You've both been living off Grandpa's generosity while undermining the company and plotting to steal it." "Steal it? I'm his daughter-in-law. Cameron is his grandson. You're just—" She stopped herself, but I could see the words she wanted to say hanging in the air between us. "Just what, Victoria? Say it." "You're just the son of a dead woman who doesn't matter anymore." The words hit like a slap, but they also crystallized everything I had been feeling for 20 years. Victoria had never seen me as family. I was just an inconvenient reminder of my father's previous life, a leftover obligation that she had been forced to tolerate. "My mother mattered to Grandpa," I said quietly. "She mattered to my father before you convinced him to forget her. And I matter enough that Grandpa left me everything you thought you were going to steal." "You can't prove." "Victoria, I have recordings of you and Cameron planning this whole thing. I have security footage of Cameron photographing confidential documents. I have evidence of your meetings with Meridian Development. I have bank records showing where the money has been going. And I have the real will, filed legally with King County 6 months ago." Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I watched her realize that her elaborate plan was crumbling. The grieving widow act was gone, replaced by cold calculation. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to admit what you've done. I want you to admit that you've been stealing from the company and plotting to sell it. I want you to admit that you've spent 20 years trying to erase me from this family. And if I don't, then you'll be explaining everything to a criminal court instead of just to me." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, my office door burst open and my father rushed in, looking more agitated than I had seen him since my mother's funeral. "What the hell is going on?" Dad demanded. "Cameron called me in a panic, saying something about fake wills and recordings. Victoria's been crying for an hour. Will somebody please explain what's happening to this family?" I looked at my father, really looked at him for the first time in years. At 58, he looked older than Grandpa had at 70. His hair was gray, his face lined with stress, and his eyes held the weariness of a man who had spent 20 years trying to keep peace in a family that had been broken from the start. "Dad, sit down. This is going to take a while." I told him everything. The USB drive, the recordings, the fake will, the meetings with Meridian Development, the years of sabotage and manipulation. I played him some of the audio recordings, watching his face grow pale as he heard his wife and stepson planning to cut me out of the family legacy. When I finished, the office was silent, except for the sound of traffic on the street below. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, probably calculating how much trouble she was in. Dad sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. "Victoria," he said finally without looking up, "is it true? David, you have to understand. Is it true?" His voice was sharp, commanding in a way I hadn't heard since I was a kid. "We were protecting Cameron's inheritance," Victoria said defensively. "Marcus already had everything handed to him. The job, Harrison's attention, opportunities that should have gone to your actual son." "Marcus is my actual son. He's your son from your first marriage. Cameron is our son, our family." Dad looked up then, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in 20 years. Anger. Not the quiet, defeated resignation that had characterized most of our family interactions, but real, burning anger. "Maria was my wife for 12 years, he said quietly. "Marcus is her son and my son. If you've spent 20 years thinking of him as some kind of leftover obligation, then I've been married to a stranger. David, please. No." Dad stood up, and for the first time in decades, he looked like the strong, decisive man my mother had married. "No more excuses. No more manipulation. No more lies." He turned to me. "Marcus, what do you need from me?" The question caught me off guard. For 20 years, I had been fighting for scraps of attention and approval from my father, watching him choose Victoria and Cameron over me again and again. Now, when it mattered most, he was asking what I needed. I need you to support the truth, Dad. That's all I've ever needed. He nodded once firmly. Then that's what you'll get. Victoria stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. David, if you do this, if you side with him against your own family. He is my family, Dad said simply. He's been my family longer than anyone else in this room. Victoria stared at him for a moment, then grabbed her purse and headed for the door. This isn't over, she said, glaring at me. You think you've won something, but you have no idea what you've started. Yes, I do, I replied. I've started telling the truth. After she left, Dad and I sat in my office for a long time, watching the Seattle skyline through the windows. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the first peaceful moment we had shared in years. I'm sorry, Marcus, he said finally. I'm sorry for all of it, for letting her make you feel like you didn't belong, for not fighting harder for you and your mother's memory, for being weak when you needed me to be strong. Dad, no, let me say this. When your mother died, I was lost, completely lost. Victoria made me feel like I could have a family again, a normal life. But I let her convince me that moving forward meant leaving the past behind. I let her make me forget that you were the most important part of that past, the part worth keeping. We talked until the sun set over Elliott Bay, 20 years of hurt and misunderstanding finally being addressed. Dad told me about the pressure Victoria had put on him to distance himself from me, how she had convinced him that favoring Cameron was necessary for family harmony. I told him about the years of feeling like an intruder in my own family, the constant message that I wasn't quite good enough, quite worthy enough, quite family enough. What happens now? He asked. Now we take back what Grandpa built. We honor his memory by making sure Harrison Construction stays true to what he believed in. And Victoria? Cameron? That's up to them. If they cooperate and admit what they've done, maybe we can work something out. If they want to fight it in court, they'll lose everything. 3 weeks later, I sat behind Grandpa Harrison's desk in the executive office of Harrison Construction, looking out at the Seattle skyline through windows that now belonged to me. The legal proceedings had moved faster than Janet Chen had predicted, partly because Victoria's lawyer Roberts had cracked under pressure and admitted to filing fraudulent documents. The real will had been validated by the court, and all of Harrison Construction's assets had been transferred to me. Victoria had been forced to return the money she had already taken from company accounts, and both she and Cameron were facing criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. But the most satisfying moment hadn't been in the courtroom or the lawyer's office. It had been the day I walked into Harrison Construction as the new owner and called an all-hands meeting with every employee, from office staff to construction crews. I know there's been a lot of uncertainty lately, and I had told them, standing in the main conference room where I had presented project reports as an employee just weeks before. But I want you to know that Harrison Construction is going to continue operating exactly the way Harry Harrison intended, with integrity, quality, and respect for the people who make this company great. The applause had been thunderous, and afterward, Bill Martinez, the foreman who had worked for Grandpa for 30 years, had shaken my hand with tears in his eyes. Your grandfather would be proud, Marcus. You're going to do right by this company. Victoria and Cameron had both left Seattle. Dad told me they had moved to California, where Victoria had family, and that she was filing for divorce. The last I heard, Cameron was working at a retail job in San Diego and living in a studio apartment, a far cry from the luxury lifestyle he had enjoyed as Harrison's golden boy. Dad and I had dinner together every Sunday now, something we hadn't done since I was a teenager. We were rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully, learning to trust each other again. He had also started dating a woman named Carol, a widowed teacher who treated me like family from the moment they met. Your father talks about you constantly, she had told me at their first dinner together. He's so proud of how you've handled everything with such grace. Grace. I wasn't sure if what I had done qualified as grace, but I had tried to handle the situation with the integrity that Grandpa Harrison had always valued. Even Victoria and Cameron, despite everything they had done, had been treated fairly in the end. They had received the settlements outlined in the real will, and I hadn't pursued the maximum criminal penalties available to me. The construction business was thriving. Without Victoria's interference and Cameron's incompetence, projects were coming in on time and under budget. I had promoted Bill Martinez to head foreman and hired 2 new project managers to handle the increased workload. The Bellevue residential complex that Victoria and Cameron had sabotaged was completed successfully, bringing in substantial profits and new contracts. But the real satisfaction came from smaller moments. Teaching a new apprentice how to read blueprints the way Grandpa had taught me. Visiting job sites and seeing the pride in workers' faces when they talked about the buildings they were creating. Maintaining the company culture of quality and integrity that had made Harrison Construction respected throughout the Pacific Northwest. 6 months after taking over the company, I was working late in the office when I found an envelope that had been left on my desk. My name was written on the outside in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Inside was a short note. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means everything worked out the way it was supposed to. Janet was instructed to give you this letter 6 months after you took control of the company, assuming you decided to keep it rather than sell it. I knew Victoria and Cameron would try to steal what we built together. I've known for years what kind of people they really are, but I also knew that you would fight for what's right, not because of money or pride, but because you understand what it means to build something that lasts. The company is yours now, completely and forever. Build beautiful things, treat people fairly, and remember that a man's legacy isn't what he accumulates, it's what he creates and how he treats the people who depend on him. I love you, son. Make me proud. Grandpa Harrison, P.S. Check the basement safe in the Bellevue house. The combination is your mother's birthday." I drove to the Bellevue mansion that night, my heart pounding as I entered the house that was now legally mine. In the basement, behind a wine rack, was a safe I had never noticed before. Inside were more documents, family photos going back generations, and a letter addressed to my grandson Marcus Harrison, future builder of great things. But the most precious item was a small wooden box containing my mother's wedding ring and a photo of her and Grandpa Harrison teaching a 10-year-old me how to hammer nails. On the back, in Grandpa's handwriting, 3 generations of Harrisons. The legacy continues. As I sat in the house where I had spent so many happy childhood weekends, surrounded by evidence of a family legacy that Victoria and Cameron had tried to steal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. The next morning I called Dad to tell him about the letter and the safe. "Your grandfather was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else," Dad said with a laugh. "I'm not surprised he had contingency plans for his contingency plans." "Dad, I want to ask you something. The house is too big for just me, and it has too many memories to just let it sit empty. Would you and Carol consider moving in? There's plenty of space, and it would mean a lot to have family here again." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dad? I'm here, son. Yes, we'd love that. Carol and I were just talking about how much we miss having family around." Family. For the first time in 20 years, the word didn't come with conditions or qualifications. It just meant what it was supposed to mean. People who choose to love and support each other, no matter what. A year later, Harrison Construction had expanded into Portland and was bidding on projects in Vancouver. The company that Victoria and Cameron had wanted to sell to Meridian Development was now competing successfully against them for major contracts throughout the Pacific Northwest. I kept Grandpa's USB drive in my desk drawer, not because I needed the evidence anymore, but as a reminder of what can happen when people forget that family is supposed to be about loyalty and love, not money and status. Sometimes I would play the recordings and remember how it felt to be the outsider, the tolerated obligation, the leftover from a previous life. But mostly, I focused on building things that would last. Great buildings, strong relationships, and a family legacy that future generations could be proud of. Every morning when I walked into Harrison Construction, I could feel Grandpa's presence in the solid foundation he had built. not just in business terms, but in the values and integrity that made the company more than just a way to make money. The little blue USB drive had contained more than just evidence of fraud and conspiracy. It had contained the truth about who we really were as a family, and more importantly, who we could choose to become. In the end, that truth had set us all free, some of us to build better lives, and others to face the consequences of their choices. Justice, I had learned, wasn't just about punishment or revenge. Sometimes justice was simply about making sure the right people ended up with what they had earned, and that the values that really mattered, integrity, loyalty, and genuine love, were the ones that determined a family's true legacy. Every evening when I locked up the office, I touched the framed photo on my desk. Grandpa Harrison, my mother, and me on a construction site, all of us wearing hard hats and enormous smiles. 3 generations of Harrisons, building something beautiful together. But the story didn't end with my taking control of Harrison Construction. Victoria and Cameron's desperation had one final, ugly chapter that would test everything I had learned about justice, family, and forgiveness. It was a cold February morning, 18 months after the will had been validated, when Janet Chen called me with news that made my coffee turn bitter in my mouth. "Marcus, we have a problem. Victoria has filed a lawsuit claiming that your grandfather was mentally incompetent when he changed his will. She's alleging elder abuse and undue influence." I set down my mug carefully, watching steam rise from the dark liquid like smoke from a fire I thought had been extinguished. "On what grounds?" "She's claiming that you manipulated Harrison during his final months, that you isolated him from family and convinced him to change his will while he was on medication that affected his judgment. She's also alleging that the security cameras and recordings were installed without his knowledge and therefore constitute illegal surveillance." The audacity was breathtaking. After everything they had done, Victoria was now trying to paint herself as the victim and me as the manipulator. But more than that, she was attacking Grandpa's memory, suggesting that the man who had built an empire from nothing was somehow too weak-minded to make his own decisions. What do we need to do? We need witnesses. People who can testify to Harrison's mental state during those final months. Medical records, documentation showing that all surveillance was installed with his full knowledge and consent. And Marcus, we need to be prepared for this to get very ugly. Victoria is going to try to destroy your reputation to save herself. She was right. Within a week, the local business news had picked up the story. Harrison Construction heir faces elder abuse allegations. The article, clearly fed information by Victoria's legal team, painted me as a manipulative opportunist who had taken advantage of a grieving widower's illness to steal a family business. The comments section was brutal. People who had never met me or Grandpa Harrison were calling me a con artist, a family parasite, a gold digger. Suddenly, every project I managed was scrutinized for signs of incompetence. Every business decision questioned as evidence of my unworthiness to run the company. But the worst part was watching the doubt creep into the eyes of people I respected. At a construction industry mixer, I overheard 2 contractors discussing whether they should continue working with Harrison Construction while the legal issues were sorted out. Clients began asking pointed questions about the company's stability and leadership. "Maybe we should settle," I told Janet during one particularly difficult week when 3 potential projects had been put on hold pending resolution of the lawsuit. "Give Victoria some money to make this go away. Marcus, if you settle, you're admitting guilt. You're saying that maybe she's right, maybe you did manipulate your grandfather. Is that the legacy you want to leave? Is that the lesson you want to teach Cameron about consequences?" She was right, but the pressure was enormous. Every day brought new challenges. Employees worried about their jobs, clients nervous about associating with a company under legal scrutiny, competitors circling like sharks sensing blood in the water. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emma Rodriguez, the accounting manager who had worked for Grandpa for 15 years, appeared at my office door one Monday morning with a box of files and a determined expression. "Mr. Harrison," she said formally, though she had called me Marcus for years, "I have something you need to see." Inside the box were financial records going back 3 years, documenting every transaction, every expense, every transfer that had occurred in Harrison Construction's accounts. But more importantly, the files contained copies of emails and memos that Grandpa himself had written, detailing his concerns about Victoria and Cameron's behavior. "He asked me to keep separate records," Emma explained. "He said if anything ever happened to him, if anyone ever questioned his decisions, he wanted there to be proof that he was completely aware of what he was doing and why." The documents were damning. Email after email showed Grandpa Harrison methodically documenting Victoria's unauthorized spending, Cameron's incompetence, and their systematic attempts to undermine my work. But they also showed something else, a sharp, analytical mind that was anything but confused or manipulated. Victoria Richardson Harrison has accessed company accounts without authorization on 17 separate occasions over the past 6 months. Read one memo dated just 3 months before his death. Each withdrawal coincided with personal expenses, jewelry, spa treatments, luxury purchases that have no connection to business operations. I have instructed Emma Rodriguez to flag any future unauthorized access and to maintain separate records of all suspicious activity. Another memo, written just weeks before he died, was even more revealing. Cameron Harrison visited the office after hours last night and attempted to access confidential client files. Security footage shows him photographing contract documents with his personal phone. I believe he is sharing sensitive information with Victoria, who may be attempting to sell this information to competitors. I have decided to accelerate my timeline for updating my will and securing the company's future. But the most powerful document was a handwritten letter Grandpa had given to Emma to hold until after his death. To whom it may concern, I, Harrison James Harrison, am writing this letter while of sound mind and body to address any future questions about my mental competency during the final months of my life. I am fully aware that my decision to leave Harrison Construction to my grandson Marcus, rather than to my daughter-in-law Victoria or grandson Cameron, may seem surprising to some people. I want to make it absolutely clear that this decision was made after careful consideration and extensive observation of all parties involved. Marcus Harrison has demonstrated over 8 years of employment that he understands not just the technical aspects of construction, but the values and integrity that built this company. He treats employees with respect, maintains quality standards, and has never put personal gain above the company's reputation. Victoria and Cameron, unfortunately, have demonstrated the opposite qualities. Victoria has repeatedly accessed company funds for personal use without authorization. Cameron has shared confidential client information with outside parties. Both have shown contempt for the employees who actually build our projects and have made it clear that they view Harrison Construction as an asset to be liquidated rather than a legacy to be preserved. I am installing security cameras and recording devices in my office, with the full knowledge and assistance of Emma Rodriguez and my attorney Janet Chen. These measures are necessary to document behavior that might otherwise be my word against theirs. Any attempt to challenge my will or claim mental incompetence on my part should be viewed with extreme skepticism. I am making these decisions because I love this company and want to ensure its survival, not because I am confused or manipulated. Signed, Harrison James Harrison, dated 6 months before his death, witnessed by Emma Rodriguez and Janet Chen. When Janet presented these documents to the court, Victoria's lawsuit collapsed like a house built on sand. Her lawyer withdrew from the case. Roberts faced additional perjury charges, and the judge issued a scathing ruling that not only validated Grandpa's will, but ordered Victoria to pay all legal costs for what he called a frivolous and malicious attempt to defraud the court. But Victoria still had one final card to play. 2 days after the lawsuit was dismissed, I received a call from my father that sent chills down my spine. "Marcus, Carol's in the hospital. Someone broke into our house last night." I raced to Swedish Medical Center, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Dad met me in the emergency room waiting area, his face pale and his clothes disheveled. "Is she okay?" "She's going to be fine. Concussion, some bruises, but nothing permanent." "Marcus, they didn't take anything. Whoever did this wasn't looking for valuables." "What do you mean?" They went straight to your grandfather's study, tore the place apart looking for something specific. Carol heard them talking about finding the rest of the files and making sure nothing else surfaces. The police investigation was thorough but inconclusive. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no witnesses except Carol, who had only heard voices in the dark. But I knew who was behind it, and more importantly, I knew why. Victoria had realized that if Grandpa had left me a USB drive with recordings, there might be other evidence hidden in the house. Evidence that could lead to more serious criminal charges than just fraud. She was looking for anything that might implicate her in embezzlement, conspiracy, or other crimes that carried real prison time. "We need to search the entire house," I told Janet. "If Grandpa hid one USB drive, there might be others." The search took 3 days. We found them hidden in places only someone who had lived in the house would think to look. Inside the false bottom of an antique jewelry box, taped under a drawer in the kitchen, embedded in the spine of a photo album. The additional evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing Victoria had stolen nearly $300,000 over 2 years. Email communications with Meridian Development discussing the sale of Harrison Construction's client list. Even recordings of Cameron bragging to friends about how he was going to gut the old man's company and retire by 30. But the most damaging evidence was a recording of Victoria and Cameron discussing me specifically. "Victoria, Marcus is the only real threat. Harrison actually trusts him, actually believes he can run the company. So what do? Frame him for something. Nothing that obvious. We make him look incompetent. We sabotage his projects, make him seem unreliable. Then when Harrison starts questioning Marcus's abilities, we step in as the responsible alternative. What if that doesn't work? Then we make sure Marcus has an accident. Construction sites are dangerous places. Equipment malfunctions happen all the time. The recording was dated 6 months before Grandpa's death. They had been planning not just to steal the company, but potentially to harm me physically if their other schemes failed. That night, I sat in the Bellevue mansion surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that went far deeper than I had imagined. Victoria and Cameron hadn't just been opportunistic thieves. They had been planning a systematic destruction of everything Grandpa had built, including me if necessary. The next morning, I called Detective Rodriguez, the officer investigating the break-in. "Detective, I have some additional evidence you need to see." The final chapter of Victoria and Cameron's story played out in King County Superior Court 6 months later. Victoria was sentenced to 4 years in prison for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Cameron received 2 years for his role in the scheme. Roberts, the lawyer who had filed the fake will, was disbarred and received 18 months. But before sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. I had struggled for weeks about whether to speak and what to say if I did. "Your Honor," I began, standing at the podium in the courtroom where justice had finally been served, "I want to talk about what Victoria and Cameron actually stole from our family. Yes, they stole money. They stole business opportunities. They tried to steal a company that my grandfather spent 50 years building. But what they really stole was time. Time that I should have spent with my grandfather in his final months without worrying about betrayal. Time that my father should have spent building a relationship with his son instead of managing the chaos Victoria created. Time that could have been spent on love and family instead of lies and legal battles. My grandfather used to say that a man's character isn't defined by what he builds, but by what he's willing to fight to protect. Victoria and Cameron fought to protect their greed. I fought to protect my family's legacy and the employees who depend on Harrison Construction for their livelihoods. I don't hate them. Hatred would give them more power over my life than they deserve. But I do want them to understand that actions have consequences, and that some things, integrity, loyalty, the trust of people who love you, once broken, can never be fully repaired. Victoria stared at me throughout my statement, her face a mask of cold resentment. But Cameron, for the first time since this whole ordeal began, looked genuinely ashamed. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood up slowly. "I want to apologize to Marcus," he said quietly, "and to the memory of Grandpa Harrison. I let my mother convince me that I deserved things I hadn't earned, and I let my jealousy of Marcus make me forget what family is supposed to mean. I'm sorry. It wasn't much, but it was something. A recognition that somewhere beneath the entitlement and manipulation, Cameron might still be capable of becoming a better person. Victoria, when given the same opportunity, simply said, "I have nothing to apologize for. I was protecting my family's interests." Even at the end, she couldn't see that her actions had destroyed the very family she claimed to be protecting. 2 years later, I was standing in the newly completed community center that Harrison Construction had built in South Seattle, watching kids play basketball on courts that bore my grandfather's name. The Harrison Community Center was our gift to the neighborhood where Grandpa had grown up, a way of giving back to the community that had shaped the man who built our family's legacy. Dad and Carol were there, along with Emma Rodriguez, who had been promoted to Chief Financial Officer, and Bill Martinez, who now owned a small construction company that Harrison Construction regularly partnered with. Even Janet Chen was there, no longer just our lawyer, but a genuine friend who had helped our family find its way back to truth and integrity. "Your grandfather would be so proud," Carol said, squeezing my arm as we watched a group of teenagers learning carpentry skills in the center's workshop. This is exactly the kind of thing he believed in, building something that makes life better for people who need it most. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, I found myself standing alone in the center's main hallway, looking at a photo display showing the construction process from groundbreaking to completion. In one photo, I was teaching a group of local high school students how to read blueprints, the same way Grandpa had taught me 20 years earlier. "Pretty amazing what you've built here." I turned to find Cameron standing behind me, looking older than his 30 years, but healthier than he had during the trial. Prison had been hard on him, but it seemed to have given him perspective that wealth and privilege never could. "Cameron, I didn't know you were out." "Got released last month. Good behavior." He looked around the community center with what seemed like genuine admiration. "I heard about this project on the news. Thought I should come see what real family legacy looks like." We stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, two half-brothers whose relationship had been poisoned by years of favoritism and manipulation. "Marcus, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you," he said finally. "But I wanted you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what you said in court, about fighting to protect what matters instead of fighting to take what you want. What are you going to do now?" "I'm working construction in Tacoma. General labor, nothing fancy. Learning the trade from the ground up, the way I should have done years ago. Maybe someday I'll be good enough to work for someone like you again." The hope in his voice was painful to hear. This was my half-brother, the spoiled golden child who had conspired to steal everything I cared about. But he was also a young man who had been raised by a manipulative mother to believe that he deserved things without earning them, and who was now trying to learn a different way to live. "Cameron, if you're serious about learning construction, really serious, not just trying to get back into the family, there might be a place for you at Harrison Construction, entry level, apprentice wages, no special treatment because of your name." His eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You would do that? After everything?" "Grandpa used to say that everyone deserves a chance to build something they can be proud of. That includes you, if you're willing to earn it." 3 months later, Cameron started work as an apprentice electrician on one of our residential projects. Bill Martinez, who remembered him as the spoiled kid who used to visit construction sites in designer clothes, was skeptical at first. "You sure about this, Marcus? Kid's got a lot to prove." "Everyone does, Bill. The question is whether they're willing to do the work to prove it." Cameron was. He showed up early, stayed late, asked questions, and took direction without complaint. He was awkward with tools at first, soft from years of easy living, but he was determined. More importantly, he treated the other workers with respect, something the old Cameron would never have thought to do. 6 months later, he was invited to the annual Harrison Construction barbecue, not as family or as a former heir, but as an employee who had earned his place on the crew. Watching him laugh with the electricians who had taught him to wire outlet boxes, I thought about how much both of us had changed since that Christmas dinner when this whole story began. Victoria, I heard through mutual acquaintances, had moved to Arizona after her release from prison. She was working as a real estate agent, using her charm and appearance to rebuild some version of the life she had lost. We had no contact, and I suspected we never would again. Some relationships, once broken by betrayal, can't be repaired. They can only be accepted as part of the past and left there. But forgiveness, I had learned, wasn't about excusing what people had done or pretending it hadn't happened. Forgiveness was about refusing to let their actions continue to poison your life, and sometimes about giving people a chance to become better than they had been. That fall, 3 years after Grandpa Harrison's death, I received a letter from the Seattle Chamber of Commerce informing me that Harrison Construction had been selected for the Small Business Excellence Award. The ceremony was being held at the Four Seasons, and I was invited to bring family and colleagues to celebrate. I brought Dad and Carol, Emma and her husband, Bill Martinez and his wife, and even Cameron, who had been promoted to journeyman electrician and was studying for his contractor's license in night school. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, looking out at a room full of Seattle's business leaders, I thought about the journey that had brought us all to this moment. "This award doesn't belong to me," I said to the audience. "It belongs to every person who has ever picked up a hammer or read a blueprint or poured concrete in service of building something that will outlast all of us. It belongs to my grandfather, Harrison Harrison, who taught me that business success means nothing if it's not built on integrity and respect for the people who do the work." I paused, looking out at the tables full of successful entrepreneurs and established business owners. But most of all, this award belongs to anyone who has ever had to fight to protect what they believe in. Family legacy isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you choose to preserve and pass on. Tonight, I'm proud to say that Harrison Construction will continue building things that matter, treating people with dignity, and proving that sometimes the right people do win in the end. The applause was warm and sustained, but what mattered most to me were the faces at my table. Dad, wiping tears from his eyes, Carol, beaming with pride, Emma, who had risked her job to help me find the truth, Bill, who had taught me that leadership means serving the people who trust you, and Cameron, who had learned that earning respect is harder but more satisfying than demanding it. After the ceremony, as we stood outside the hotel watching Seattle's skyline light up against the night sky, Dad put his arm around my shoulders. "Your mother would be so proud of who you've become," he said quietly, "and so would Harrison. You didn't just save the company, you saved our family." As I drove home that night through the quiet streets of Seattle, I thought about the USB drive that had started it all, now locked in a safe in my office, as a reminder of how quickly trust can be broken and how much work it takes to rebuild it. The whispers of vengeance that had driven me through the darkest moments of the legal battle had long since faded, replaced by something stronger. The quiet satisfaction of work well done, relationships rebuilt, and a legacy preserved not through anger or revenge, but through persistence, integrity, and the courage to fight for what really matters. The city lights reflected off Puget Sound as I crossed the bridge toward home, and I could almost hear Grandpa Harrison's voice and the sound of the wind through the car windows. "Build things that last, son. Build things that matter." I had. We all had. And in the end, that was the best revenge of all.